Before we begin, I want to take the opportunity to thank my brothers and sisters, my Bellevue family, for just the outpouring of support over the past couple of weeks at the passing of my father. The cards, the flowers, the plants, the memoriams, everything like that, but just to know that I was in your thoughts and in your prayers continually just brings great comfort to me and my mother and my family as well. So on behalf of my mother and sisters and all of our family, we thank you so much. We are blessed to be a part of the Lord's family. You know, we talk about this morning a marriage made in heaven. My parents would have been married 54 years come April 3rd this year. So they were married almost 54 years. And in today's day and age where marriages seem to be something that are thrown away or tossed away, we don't even put a value on marriage a lot of times today in today's world. You used to hear the statistic that 1 out of every 2 marriages end in divorce. Well, that's not the case anymore. It's about 1 out of 3, depending on the statistics. So where people are saying, wow, that's great. The divorce ratio is going down. Well, the problem is the number of marriages are going down because people are more than likely just cohabitating, living together. And the people who do get married are getting married for a more specific reason. Some of them get married for no other reason than a tax deduction. Some people don't get married for the simple fact so that they can keep on their health care plan, so it doesn't impact them. So there's a lot of different views and things when it comes to marriage. But marriage is the oldest institution. It was founded, it was created, and it was instituted by God Himself. Man gets married, but it always involves God in that marriage that He ordains. When we look today, we see many different things, and a lot of times we joke about marriages. We joke and say, marriage is a good deal. And, there's people say, the first part of marriage, it's ideal. And then after that first part of the marriage, it kind of starts going from an ideal to an ordeal. And then you're kind of stuck in this ordeal for a while, and then you probably start thinking, well, I want a new deal. And we make jokes about marriages, but reality, it is one of the most sacred relationships we have. In fact, I believe it's the most sacred relationship that we can have on this earth with another human being. We see different jokes. It says, marriage means commitments. Of course, so does insanity. I married Miss Wright, I just didn't know her first name was Always. Now we say, oh, that's just, men being, to women and stuff. But look at this. The first friend says, you're wearing your wedding ring on the wrong finger. And she responds, well, I married the wrong man. That doesn't give you the permission to move your rings. I see a lot of people just going, well, if that's the case, I can do that. But we make jokes about marriage. We treat marriage lightly in today's society. We see, and just in the news in the past couple of weeks, that a woman married herself. She decided that if she was not married by the age of 40, that she was going to marry herself. And at first glimpse, you would say, oh, what is she doing? Well, she was saying that this is a ceremony that I'm going to say that I love myself and that I'm good enough and that I'm worthy. And so she had this elaborate, ornate ceremony with 3 different ministers that did this ceremony. But people marry weird things all over the world. One, in 2006, a British woman named Cindy has changed her name. She married a dolphin in a ceremony in Israel, but they'd had a 15-year relationship, so she didn't rush into it. So it was okay. In 2008, a San Francisco woman fell in love with the Eiffel Tower, and so she married it and changed her name to Erica Latour Eiffel. That was my French accents, which are very poor. But she also was in love with a bow and her fence in her backyard. But her only commitment is really to the Eiffel Tower. Not making this up. In 2000, let's see, did I hit that? 2007, Liu Yi of China decided it would be better to marry himself rather than be single. Same type of thing. Well, during his ceremony, he had a cardboard cutout of himself in the ceremony, and he was in a beautiful red dress. 2006, a Hindu woman fell in love with a snake. She married the snake in accordance with the Hindu marriage rituals. People have married, well, those type of things, married a chair, a pillow, a doll, you name it, they've married it. Dog, cat, goat. The guy who married the goat feels that it was the best thing for him to do because as soon as he married this goat, his whole life turned around and he started having better fortune. Everything kind of turned around for him when he married a goat. Never thought I would utter those words. And yet we laugh and joke about marriages. We devalue marriage and we complain and we say that marriage is being devalued in the United States of America by certain legislations that are being put forth and everything like that. But brothers and sisters, we can devalue a marriage just as much as anybody else between a man and a woman when we don't honor that covenant relationship that we make with God. So we're going to look this morning at marriage. Those passages that Rick read this morning, those are going to be our two main texts. We're going to start with Genesis chapter 2, 18 through 24, and then we're going to jump over to Matthew as we start to close. But when we look at marriage today, do you value yours? Do you value the covenant relationship that you made with your spouse and with God? Because marriage is not a contract. Yes, that's the civil part of it, but Adam and Eve were married, and generations upon generations have been married without a civil document being handed out, without a public declaration. Marriage still took place because marriage is made in heaven, and it takes place because God has created this institution. And we're going to look this morning of how He created it. When we look at our text this morning, and we're not going to go back there, but it said in verse 18 of Genesis chapter 2, it says, it is not good, I'm going to make a suitable helper for him. I'm going to make a suitable helper for Adam. And then he goes on to say, okay, Adam, I'm going to sit back and watch while you name all of these animals. And so the rainbow trout, swam up, and Adam goes, look like a rainbow trout, largemouth bass, pterodactyl, brown bear, black bear, polar bear, duck-billed platypus, chupacabra, that's obvious, chupacabra. And so he named all of these things, and you have to know that as Adam watched and named all of these animals, and in my mind, I see them coming in pairs. That's my mind. That he saw them and knew that they were not alone, that there was one of their own kind. And it says that, in verse 31 of chapter 1, it says, God had made all of these things and it was good. But when he looks over here in Genesis chapter 2, 18 through 24, he sees that there's not a suitable helper for Adam. And it says, it's not good for man to be alone. And in the Hebrew, it actually carries with it, aloneness is a bad thing. Now, you could be sitting here this morning and still be alone. Loneliness is not about the number of people that are surrounding you. Loneliness is about relationships and about people caring for you and having somebody in the fight and the fray with you. And when we see that over and over again, in Proverbs chapter 18, verse 22, Proverbs 18, verse 22, it says, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. Some of you will say, hey, I'm just not destined to be married. I have a friend who's older than me, much, much older than me. He's 52. I've known him for over half his life. He lives in Pennsylvania now. He's a single guy. He will never, ever get married, I don't think. He's too set in his ways. He's ornery. He has, he's adopted some kids. He's dated women before, but he's just too picky. Or maybe he's just too hard to get along with is probably the case. I mean, this is a guy that's been single, he's 52 years old, so he's been single his whole life. He has one room in his house, and he's building another house. He's got one room in his house that are just dedicated to baseball, football, basketball, and hockey cards. He has over 300,000 cards. And I know that if his house started to burn down, he'd throw the two kids out, and then he would hug all of those cards and just hang on to them until, the fire consumed him. But is that what we were created for? Now, I'm not going to get into that some people just do not want to be married and everything like that, but I want to talk about marriage that has been created in heaven by God. And when we look at that, we see that, hey, in verse 18 it says, I will make a helper suitable for him. Not a horse, not even a goat, snake, bird, nothing. He said, I will make a helper suitable for you. The writer in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, 9 through 12, talks about strength in numbers, if you will. It says, two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. For if one of them falls, if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But look at this next clause. But woe to the one who falls when there is not another. There's no one else to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower or overcome him who is alone, two can resist him. This is probably one of the most familiar phrases out of Ecclesiastes to a lot of people. It says, a cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart or broken, or is not easily broken. I don't know what I would do if I didn't have my helper, my wife, my partner. You know, when God says, I will make a helper suitable for him, he did not say, I will make a provider for him. I will make a lover for him. I will make a cook for him or a cleaner for him. He says, I will make a helpmate, a helper for him. Now, a woman can be all of those things, and most often she is. But when God created woman, he first created her for the role of being that partner, that helpmate for man. And I think we forget that, especially as men, that our wives were created, and their role was created for us as a wife first and foremost. All of the others, the provider, all of those, the mother of children, are secondary and tertiary to the fact that we have a helper. I went through about a decade period of my life when I was in excruciating pain all the time, through 4 back surgeries. There are those who are here who have been in pain a lot longer. There are those here this morning who are in great pain. I don't know what I would have done if I did not have Lisa to be there with me. Because in a joyless time in my life, when there was no joy, it appeared in my life and nothing, Lisa brought me joy. And when there was sadness and quiet times and sorrow, she brought me laughter. Was she all those other things too? Absolutely. Life is difficult when we get married. But she was my helper. God created Eve, woman, to be that helper for Adam. And he also created us, gentlemen, to be that helper for our wives. Do we have different roles? Yes. And we'll talk about that in the next few weeks. But we are supposed to be together. And we saw, as Rick read earlier, the two become one flesh. And we look at Scripture and we're like, man, what does it mean here? What does that mean that two are better than one? Marriage is created by God. It never says in Genesis chapter 2 or in Matthew 19 that God says they were given a marriage certificate. Marriage is made in heaven by God. It is a work of God, and it's up to you and I to tend and maintain that relationship. It says, if he's going to make, in verse 20 says, but for Adam there was not found a suitable helper for him. And he created woman. Man, ish. Woman, isha. And we see that, in the wedding ceremony, and the groom is standing up here and his knees are shaking, and he's staring back as the wedding music starts and the bride starts walking down, and perhaps it's her father that's walking her down the aisle, and she gets to the front and he's getting ready to hand her over to the fiance and says, who gives this woman to be wed? And the father will say, I do, or her mother and I. Well, in Genesis, we see the first evidence of that. where God brought Eve to Adam and says, here is your helper. And if you look over in Genesis chapter 2, verse 23, it says, the man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman. Why? Because she was taken out of man. This is where we get man, ish, woman, ishash. And so you have that man, woman. This is what God created for marriage to be in the beginning. And when we get into Matthew 19 and the Pharisees are trying to trick Jesus up and they're asking him about, hey, in verse 3, is it lawful for a man to divorce his woman or his wife for any reason at all? Jesus goes back to what originally God had intended for man and woman. And that is a marriage. And Adam had to be like, wow, she looks like me, except better. Wow, look at that. No duck-billed platypus thing here. No chupacabra. Just gorgeous. And he said, she's different than me, but she's like me. And I think, men, we lose that awe when we look at our wives that we had when we first fell in love, and we say, oh, wow, she's pretty. But beauty fades. The heart will last forever. And then in chapter 2, verse 24 out of Genesis says, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to this wife, to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. A miracle has occurred. God has taken that rib out of Adam and created a woman, and now the two are becoming one flesh. And we say, well, what does that mean? Is it just something as simple as the consummation of a marriage? Is it something to where it's the joining of two souls, soulmates? What does it mean for the two to become one flesh? I think when God created this institution of marriage, he wanted to teach us and ensure that we understood that taking the flesh apart in a divorce hurts both. And it's not what he intended. Marriage is not a contract between a husband and a wife. Marriage is a covenant between a man and a woman and God Almighty. Man will break the covenant with the woman and say, hey, that's it. But does he ever acknowledge the fact that he's broken the covenant with God? Marriage was created to help us, to nurture us, to allow us to procreate, to grow, to teach, so that we can worship God. It's to be valued. It's to be loved. It's to be treasured. If marriage is like, in fact, what we said, a work of God, then it's up to us to maintain it, to nurture it, to grow it. Let's go to the next slide, please. It says, it is better to have a spouse compliment you than compliment you. Now, we all want to say, hey, Jeff, you look good today. Hey, Jeff, I like that tie. Hey, Jeff, I like that. Hey, Jeff, you look cute today. That's what Lisa said to me. I said, hey, does my dad's tie look okay with the shoes? It looks cute. I'm like, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm not saying we don't give compliments to our spouse, but it's more important that we compliment. We fill in those gaps. We create a better spouse because of our contribution. I know that I'm a better man and a better husband and a better father because of my wife, Lisa, who compliments me. And I think I'm the same way for her. You look good or you look cute. Yeah, it feels good on the ears, but it doesn't get us through the tough times. It doesn't get me through the tough times. The past 2 weeks, I've had such an outpouring of love. And it started with my best friend. And as emotional as those past 2 weeks were, it was awesome. Because I was with my family, I was with my best friend, and I knew Dad was home. Not struggling to breathe or anything like that. I'm in a better place today than I was 2 weeks ago when I was concerned for his struggle and his suffering. Why? Because Dad's home. If there's any real feeling, I'm sad he beat me there. But we'll meet again. Because I know that I love my God and I want to follow him. I wouldn't be here today, standing here today, though, if it wasn't for my helpmate, my wife. Because there was a period for 10 years of our marriage to where God was not first in my life. In fact, God wasn't third or fifth or 10th in my life. Because she lifted me up and held me to the covenant that I made with her and the covenant I made with him. I stand before you today. Not better than you, not better than my spouse, not better than anyone, but a child of God who has been forgiven for his erring ways. That's what a helper does. That's what a spouse does, whether it's man to woman, woman to man, husband, wife. That's what he created here. You know, and I often thought that, and Lisa still tells me this, she goes, sometimes I think you just want me to agree with you all the time. And I'm like, yes, you finally get it. I mean, well, yeah. I'm just like, it took you this long to figure that out. And she's like, you just want me to agree with everything you said? I'm like, well, if that's a possibility, if I get a choice, well, of course. But think about this. If two people agree on everything, then one of them is really not needed. My wife is that sandpaper to my rough edges sometimes. Like I'm like, okay, this is what I'm going to preach, and this is what I'm going to say, and this is how I'm going to say it. She's like, whoa there, let's buff this out, make it a little smoother. Let's say not come that direct. Let's tell the truth, but make sure we're doing it in love, or don't use that word, but use this word. Or, you know, teacher mess with my kid, I'm going to go up there and, you know, immediately I want to talk to the principal, the superintendent, and everything. And Lisa's like, let's just send an email to see the teacher's side. I'm like, well, if you want to do that way, I need that sounding board. I think all couples do. You know, you think that it would be wonderful that if she always agreed with you and always just did what you said and everything without saying, well, hey, what about this? I don't think we'd be as far along in our relationship as we are today and as deep in our relationship and trusting one another if it wasn't for those questions that I ask of her and she asks of me. That's why we have a helper. That's why we have been created in the image of God. And in Matthew chapter 19, you know, we just touched on it. In verse 3 it says, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? Because the Pharisees are like, okay, let's catch him, let's catch him, let's catch him. And Jesus says, hold on a second. No. And he goes back to Genesis 1, verse 27. He says, God created man as in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And then he goes back to Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2 says, is that next, guys? Genesis chapter 2? Nope. Okay. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 and 19:6. Let's go Matthew 19:6. Matthew 19:6 says, does not say? It does say, they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. You know, and that's that's almost a standard legal wordage there in ceremonies today of weddings. What God has joined together, let no man separate. But so often those are just empty words that men and women or the officiate says over a couple as they're beginning to get married. God has created marriage to be for eternity, for a lifetime, till death does us part, till we die. Do we get that? Do you treat your relationship with your spouse as something to say, okay, we're having struggles, let's move on to the next best thing, let's trade in, let's trade up? Or do we say that there's something that needs to be worked on? Something that needs to be good or better or great requires work. Nowhere in Scripture, because I've looked and says, okay, does it say marriage is going to be a breeze? Anybody had an easy marriage? Anybody been married over 50 years in here? Raleigh, Jim, was it always easy? Yeah, I'm not saying, it doesn't mean that it's a bad marriage, but you have struggles. And the struggles for you may be minor, but for somebody else it might be major. But it's important to have that husband, that wife to go through it with us. You know, we say that marriage is a decision. You know, my father-in-law will tell you that I was a little slow on the decision making when it came to marrying Lisa. It was 3 years. I thought I was rushing. I didn't know better. I figured, good 15, 16, 17 years of dating, I might be ready. It may be a human decision, but it's made by God in heaven. And I want to close here with a couple things. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. And you can go ahead and shut the slides down. Just leave that up. Yeah, we'll go there. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. For this reason, a man will leave his father and his mother and be what? Joined to his wife. And they shall become one flesh. To me, this verse really is the foundation of marriage. And there's 3 words up there: leave, cleave, and weave. Now, the second word we'll get to in a second, because you're thinking cleaver, something like that. But that's not what it means in marriage. There's an older meaning there. But it says, a man should leave his father and mother. Marriage is about leaving to begin with. It's about making sure that that relationship with your spouse is number one as far as earthly relationships. Men, if you are still allowing your mother or your father to dictate how you live your life and in your marriage, stop it. Grow up. Be a man. Be a husband. Because your first responsibility is not to your mother and father. Yes, you obey them, but that is secondary to you and your responsibility to your wife. Cleave. King James Version, cleave to your spouse. Be joined. That cleave word actually means to be adhered to. It's like gluing together, that if there's any separation, it's going to be tearing apart. Cleave to one another. And it's not that separating. It's an old word. It goes back. And yeah, I even looked, and you can see the word use of cleave in that context is slowly diminishing. But for some reason, like the last 5 years, the word cleave, to be joined to, is actually increasing. I don't know why. And then there's weave. You don't become one with your spouse when the minister says you may now kiss your bride. Weaving a marriage into blending 2 hearts as one takes work. It takes patience. It takes work. It takes love. It takes effort. It takes compassion. It takes work. It takes work. It takes God. It is a marriage made in heaven when we keep God at that foundation in the center of our marriage, to where we honor our spouses daily, continually. I say in a ceremony that the words that you speak today, these vows that you speak, take but a short few moments to say, but they take a lifetime to live up to. That is true. Husbands, wives, how are you living up to your vows? How are you living up to that covenant that you made with God on your wedding day? Marriage is a wonderful institution. Honor it. It tells us in Ephesians 5:22-33 as we close, that marriage, about husbands and wives submitting to one another and loving one another, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. If Christ loved the church, the body, us, that much, and we're called to love our spouse like that, how are we doing? How are we doing? And if our relationship with Christ and with God is us of being that bridegroom, the church, the bride of Christ, the groom, how are we doing? How are we doing? For those of you who have obeyed the gospel, there's a covenant that we made. For those of you who are still outside of God's family, there's a covenant that's made. When we give ourselves to God and say, you know what? I'm sinful. I've been sinful. I need you. Because I can't take away my sin. I can't make myself better. I can't redeem myself and become one of yours. I need that blood that was shed on that cross for me. That's available this morning. If you want to become a part of God's family, if you want to become a part of that church, of the bride of Christ, don't delay this morning. If there's anything we can do, if you're having a bad day, if you need the prayers of the church, if you have praises that you want to share with the body here, then come up and share them with us. If there's anything we can do, please come while we stand and sing.